I always feel like a lamb. Well, today I have just a short thought for you. Today, as I was walking out of my house, I have rose bushes planted alongside my porch. And I looked at those rose bushes, and I've looked at them several times. You know, we've had some cold weather and some bad weather. Although when I got up today and realized it was 57 degrees out there, I thought, nothing like Nebraska, right? But I saw those rose bushes, and almost all the leaves were brown and gone. But on the very tips of several of those bushes was a very nicely formed green rosebush leaf. And I should have brought it today. I felt it a little bit, see if it was, like going to fall off the minute I touched it, but it didn't. Here's this little rosebush leaf after all of the freezing cold temperatures that we've had, and the wind and everything else. All the other leaves are down in my driveway, and I've cleaned them out several times, but they're still there, brown. Trees are all gone. But here's this one or two or three little tiny rosebush leaves hanging on to those stems. And I know one day I'm going to have to go out there and cut them off so that the roses can grow again. But I was just impressed. I was impressed today with the fact that they were hanging on. And I thought to myself, sometimes good things happen to us. Sometimes bad things happen to us. Sometimes we get beat up a little bit by the winds of maybe people that come into our lives that aren't so good. And sometimes we get blessed by the people that come into our lives. But whatever it is, God has said that He's going to take care of us. And He's going to bless us no matter what. He's going to take good care of us. And so even though you may feel kind of bad sometimes, and you're just barely hanging on like that little rosebush leaf, you know that God is going to bless you. And when I saw that this morning, it just reminded me and said, God is going to bless me. If He can bless that little leaf on the end of that little bush, He's much more concerned about me. And He's much more concerned about you. So as you go back to your chairs, just keep in mind that God is going to bless you more than anything else in the world today. All right? Go on back to your chairs, and thank you for helping out today. Appreciate it.
Our scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, and I'll be reading verses 25 through 37. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law, and what is your reading of it?" So he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live." But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Then Jesus answered and said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise."
Thank you, Carol, for the scripture reading. Well, this morning we do have a special speaker that's going to be with us, Dr. Wagner. I'm not going to read her biography. You can do that yourself. It is right here. As you guys know, last year I went down to Atlanta, Georgia for a 2-part training, leadership training for nonprofit leadership in the spring and in the fall. And it was during those trainings for our Adventist Community Services that I was made aware of Dr. Wagner and her ministry there at the North American Division. And so I made some inquiries about how we can do better fundraising, how we can look for grants, how we can change the atmosphere of our church and the giving in our church, and have talked with her a few times and some of her staff. Michael Brown, I believe, is the one that I had the most direct conversations with. And so we worked out a chance for her to be able to come here and to present for us this 2-part thing where she's going to be bringing us this message, The Power of One, the sermon title for this morning, and this afternoon, the 7 steps to successful fundraising in your church, that she's going to be presenting at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And normally, this would be quite a costly service to bring someone in, to bring a speaker like this. But this is being underwritten by the North American Division, I believe. And so this is a no-cost training seminar to us. So we are very privileged within our denominational structure to have supports like this. And so she's going to be coming up and presenting for that. And so I just want to thank the North American Division and PSI, which is the institution that I'm sure you'll explain a little bit about, that she works for. And thank you so much for coming here. So, Dr. Wagner, the floor is yours. Take all the time that you need.
I doubt that he meant that I should take all the time I want. It is a real pleasure to be here with you. Especially a nice surprise to see some familiar faces. Where did one of them go? There you are. Going back to my very early academy teaching days, and then who could forget the smile of this gentleman right here? I'd know that anywhere. Going back to Union College, and then you and my husband connected at Forest Lake. And thank you for the lovely music. Really enjoyed that. It really is a pleasure to worship here with you, and especially this afternoon to talk about how do we get those funds that we need in order to improve our services, our facilities, what we can do for others. And the North America Division is unique in funding this kind of a consulting office. No other denomination does that or other division. I still continue to work for the Indiana University School of Philanthropy, so I've covered a lot of bases. And I think it was really interesting and coincidental, the mission spotlight that you had. Because about 1.5 years ago, I was actually doing training in Croatia. And people came from the surrounding countries to learn how to do their fundraising. And subsequently, I've gone to several of the countries to help them, such as Albania. And the particular school that was pictured there, they talked to me about that school. How do we get more funds? How can we help more students? And I particularly like this mission spotlight because it points out that it's not about the money. It's about good causes that have a price tag. And it's that price tag we'll try to fulfill as we talk this afternoon. Now, for many years, I have traveled all over the world doing training and speaking and counseling and consulting. And it's been my usual practice to try to get to the location the evening before, because you never know about flights. You might get stuck in the airport. Just about everything short of a plane crash has happened to me in all these travels. So I try to get to my location the evening before and meet with the contact people, the people arranging the event, and work out all the final details. And then I feel more secure. So one time I was working in northern Florida, and I did that. A couple of women came to see me. We finalized on the details, talked about what does your audience want? What are you looking for? What do you want from me? And we lined up everything. And then as they left, they said, okay, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, be at the front door of the hotel, and a lady in a green car will pick you up. Simple enough, right? So the next morning, a little bit before 8 o'clock, I was there dutifully at the front door of the hotel. And a woman in a green car drove up, rolled down her window, and said, "Are you waiting for me?" And I said, "Yes," and I got in the car. Well, we had this really pleasant chat for about 10 miles down the road. Talked about, of course, when strangers meet, they talk about the weather. That's the first thing. I was so pleasantly surprised after -5 in Indianapolis, where I came from, to look at my phone and see that you had 55-degree weather, at least up in London. London, Kentucky. And so we chatted, and we had a really nice visit, and then I thought, okay, I have to get my mind on what I'm going to do today, make that switch. And so I turned to her and I said, tell me a little bit more about the audience, and I had some specific questions. Well, she's driving along, and she starts staring at me to the point where I felt like saying, look at the road, don't look at me. Finally, she says, "Who are you?" The only thing I could think of to say was, "Who are you?" And we realized it was the wrong lady in the wrong green car. We also vowed we were not telling anybody about this little incident, at least not that day. And she hung a Yui, as the kids say. We went back to the hotel, and I dutifully waited for the right green car with the right lady. Do we always know where we're going? A little bit later this morning, I'm going to share a personal story of my family as refugees fleeing communism. We didn't know where we were going, but one of the blessings, folks, was the Adventist church. The Adventist church that took us in and truly gave us the Good Samaritan experience that I want to, as soon as I figure this out, I did it. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the most famous stories of the Bible. Now, when I was teaching at Union College, when Dennis and I met, one summer I was asked to prepare to teach the Bible as literature. I thought that would be rather simple. I'm a preacher's kid. I know my Bible. But once I started looking at the Bible as, first of all, a historical document. Secondly, a lot of it is poetry. And some of it is stories. I know one thing that grabbed me was when I was preparing to teach the book of Jonah as literature. And I had taught American literature. And some people say, oh, the book of Jonah is just mythology, and it's just there to make a point. No, folks, that kind of thing actually happened in New England during the whaling days back in the 18th century, where a young boy of about 12 went on a whaling ship with his father, and as kids are, ran around the ship and fell overboard, and the whale swallowed him up. So, of course, they quickly caught the whale. The poor thing wasn't his fault, and had him on the deck and cut him open, and the boy stepped out. Now, there were two reasons why people couldn't say that it was mythology in the New England days, was because the stomach juices had made his face look very mottled, very different. It had eaten away at some of the skin. And secondly, there were all the witnesses. So it was real news, and it happened. So as I was studying to teach the Bible as literature, I realized how global the effect of the story of the Good Samaritan really is, and how inspirational for us, the power of one individual to make a difference. And that's what I would like to illustrate, the power of one individual to make a difference, and then think about that compounded power when we work together, each one of us with our talents and skills. Now, as the scripture was beautifully read, this was an interesting story that Jesus told. When the young attorney said, "Who is my neighbor?" Because some things never change. We are in an era where people say, "I don't want them as our neighbors." And we have gone through these stages in both world and American history. Who is our neighbor? So as Jesus told this story, and especially if you've read the parables, you know Jesus was a masterful storyteller. First of all, what was the setting? The setting was a dramatic one, and his listeners knew, because the travelers that came into the story started in Jerusalem, and over a distance of only 20 miles, the road dropped 3,400 feet. And it was an inhospitable land. Most people tried to travel in groups. Obviously, in the story, they took a chance. We're traveling alone. But it was well known for having many robberies, murders along that road. So first of all, we have a dramatic setting. And here is a picture of that particular setting. Now we get to the characters. First comes a priest, the leader of the Jewish times. So you think, okay, this traveler who was going along, and what happened to him was almost predictable, that he was accosted, he was beaten up, he was robbed, and he was lying by the side of the road, looking in a condition that people actually thought he was dead. So here comes the leader of the people. And of course the listeners thought, okay, this is going to be a short story. What did that leader do? As we read the account and also historical interpretations of it, that leader didn't even cross a road to check on that body lying there, because he knew that if he as much as touched a dead body, he would lose his turn of temple service. And that meant more to him than a possible person in trouble. Then came the Levite. And if you remember your Bible stories, your Bible history, in the days of Exodus, you remember which one was a tribe that was actually designated to be of service to the people? The Levites. So, again, Jesus' listeners, now they're seeing a little turn in the story, and Jesus' listeners said, okay, he's going to get help. The Levite went over, checked on him, and then he realized that maybe he was making himself as vulnerable as the unfortunate traveler who looked like he was near death, if not dead. So he quickly left also. Then Jesus brought into the story somebody who was, by his listeners, thought to be the evil one. The Jewish people and the Samaritans had age-old animosities. They hated each other. It was historical. And you can almost hear the music. You know how it is when you're watching TV and the bad guy comes and you can hear the music. They must have felt the same way. Here came the Samaritan. Imagine their surprise when the Samaritan is the one that turns out to be the hero of the story. Really illustrating who is my neighbor. So when we think about the details of the story, we have to wonder, what kind of a man was this Samaritan? Obviously, he wasn't wealthy. He wasn't traveling with a caravan. And while there are different depictions, of which I will show you a few of these, he had a donkey. That's the most standard. When I was growing up as a kid in Bolivia, I had a donkey. They're smart and stubborn and wonderful creatures. That was all he had, according to all accounts that we have read. So he knew, first of all, what to do. Do we sometimes come on a scene and we think, what am I going to do? He must have had enough experience, enough training, but most importantly, a big heart to make himself vulnerable, to take care of this unfortunate traveler. And then what did he do? He put him, the beaten up man, on his own donkey, took him down, making himself more vulnerable, took him down to an inn. And one thing that interests me, his credit must have been good, or they must have known him as an honest people, because they said, he said, okay, here's enough money. If you spend more on this man and taking care of him, I'll pay you the next time I'm through here. A Samaritan, a hated Samaritan. This is the picture of that inn, they believe, today. You can still see it's a very inhospitable location. This is the actual terrain of that road between Jerusalem and Jericho. What has interested me is, as we look at all the illustrations, and I only pulled together a few, how many types of people are depicted as the Good Samaritan. Different versions, different cultures that relate to the story of the Good Samaritan. Different ways that the Good Samaritan is depicted, even in Southeast Asia. This truly is one of the universal stories that we find in the Bible that has had global impact and has crossed religious and cultural lines. I was fortunate to run into a Good Samaritan when I was just a little kid. I was born in what used to be a little-known country hidden up in Northern Europe called Estonia, one of the three Baltics. It was a very prosperous country for a long time, although we were under many, many other rulers, because as you noticed, the strategic location, let me go back, the strategic location, we go back a couple thousand years BC as an identifiable country and people with historical records. And back then, when it was important to have access to water, it in particular attracted all kinds of nations who won us, who took us over. And for about 700 years, the German barons owned us and our land, no matter who else was in charge politically. And in fact, I found out the last time I was there, I located the actual manor, we saw the historical records, the beautiful park-like era where the German baron and his family lived, and my ancestors worked on that land. So this is the flag, Parliament, our coat of arms, and Estonia was fortunate to become free during the Bolshevik Revolution and World War I. Up to that time, we had always been under other rulers and countries. Now, one of the interesting things is English has become so much of a unifying language in the world because I'm fluent in Spanish, and between my Spanish, English, and German language, I learned 4 languages before I was 10 years old. I can pretty much get by in a lot of the world as I travel, but Estonian is unique. It is part of the language family that has Finnish, Hungarian, and a few other tribes in the mountains of Russia. So maybe you'd like to hear Estonian. Now, it's kind of unlikely that you'll run into another Estonian. Does anybody know another Estonian besides me, Dennis and David? Okay, we need to talk. So, let's together say John 3:16 in English. Or if you know another language, say it in your language. And then I'm going to say it in Estonian. Ready? For God so loved the world Amen. In Estonian, sest nõnda on Jumal maailma armastanud, et ta oma ainussündinud poja on andnud, et üks, kes ei usu temast, ei saaks hukka, vaid et temal oleks igavene elu. That's our language. You can imagine how my parents, now I was a little kid, but my parents had to learn all these languages in sequence, and it was quite taxing to the brain. So, Estonia was, between the 2 world wars, a very prosperous country, very old country. We treasure some of the old buildings, some that were preserved, some that were rebuilt after the bombings. But then came a historic point in world history. If you can imagine a big table here, and one end of the table is sitting one of the most evil men that this world has experienced with his team around him. On the other end of the table sits another man of equal reputation and character with his team around him. And in the middle, they have maps. One of them says to the other, okay, I want this part of Europe. The other guy says, okay, if you get that part, I get this part. Anybody think of asking us what we wanted? You can already imagine who these people were. On one side was Stalin, and the other side was Hitler. They didn't trust each other, as history would prove, and they hated each other, but they were carving up Europe regardless of the people, of the history, of anything, or the suffering. So that's how the communists came into Estonia, and they began to infiltrate government, infiltrate parts of society. They didn't take it over with war, but before the people knew it, they were under a communist rule. And that's when the horrors began, the knock in the middle of the night. People dragged out onto trucks, taken off to Siberia if not killed immediately. For what reason? Very few people knew. Maybe a neighbor had complained about it. My parents knew one person whose father had been a sculptor and had done a beautiful statue for freedom, and so they shot him. Horrible times. And probably the most horrible was the secret police. The secret police could be hidden among you, and you could sit there and you wouldn't know who had been bribed, coerced, or threatened to report on the people. Unfortunately, we have some modern examples of that kind of behavior too in some countries where I've been working. So one day my father got a little notice in the mail. And this notice said, at such and such a date, you have to appear, and it gave an address. His heart sank. At that time, my father was the leading pastor in Estonia, the big church right there in our capital city, Tallinn. And also, he was heading up the small school, very similar to the school that you saw the mission spotlight about, but smaller, because we're a very small country. We only have about 1.38 million people. He said, I don't know what to do. He kept saying, is it time to leave? Many Adventist senior leaders had already left because the KGB, the secret police, was rounding up anybody who was a leader, whether it was commerce or industry or education, of course, government and religious leaders. And he decided, after much prayer, that he would go to that interview. So in that first interview, this communist official was asking him about the church. How do you feel about the economic situation? And my dad was trying to be very non-committal and to be very innocent because he didn't even dare tell his church members or other church leaders what was happening because that would endanger their lives. It was better if they didn't know. So this went on for a few weeks. He had to go for these weekly meetings. And at one of the meetings, about 6 weeks later, the official got very annoyed. And he said, you're not giving me any information. And he took out a piece of paper and he put it in front of my father and he said, if you don't sign here that you have come voluntarily to give information, you're not going to leave this room alive. My mother was praying. The church members knew something was going on, even though they didn't have the details, which was the only wise thing to do. And they were praying. I wasn't born yet, but I have an older brother, and he remembers how fervently they prayed. So the official, instead of shooting him on the spot, said, okay, next week, you need to meet us, and he gave an apartment address. My dad thought, boy, this is probably the end. You know, they'll shoot me there, stash my body, nobody will know what happened to me. It happened to many people. He thought, is it time to go? Now think about it, folks. Leaving everything, starting with your country, your work, all your relatives, your belongings, which are probably of the least value when it comes to that kind of life-saving decision. He said, not yet. So on the appointed time, he went, knocked on the door of this apartment, and to his surprise, there was no answer. He knocked again. Now, I think I might have been tempted to say, okay, I tried, bye. But he waited, and pretty soon the door opened just a little crack. And a little elderly woman looked around, and they both looked at each other. They didn't expect to see each other. Finally, she said, what do you want? Well, my dad was so astonished. And he said, well, I'm supposed to meet someone here. She looks at him. So he starts describing this person. And, you know, ultimately, it's hard to describe each other. When I travel all over, I'm glad when people show up at the airport with my name because I'm not always sure they'll recognize me or me recognize them. Finally, after he gets through explaining all of this, she looks at him and she says, there's no one here, just me. And she slowly shut the door. My father was so astounded because it was common knowledge that if the KGB contacted you, you either worked with them or you were a goner. In fact, that happened with a lot of Adventists, including in the country that we just featured up here, people telling me some leaders lost their lives because they wouldn't cooperate with the communist regime. Many years later, when my father was working in the Southern New England Conference, they wanted to honor him for 50 years of service to the church. And I don't remember where I was, but they called me and said, this is a secret, but we want to know a few details about his life. And I had written my first book on our experience, and so I knew quite a bit. But that incident stuck out. And so I said to my dad, why do you think they let you go instead of killing you on the spot, which is what you would have expected? He was a wonderful man, wonderful person, very, very intelligent, but also a very humble leader. And I still remember he was looking out of the kitchen door window at his huge garden. He had a green thumb that regrettably I didn't inherit. I could kill your plastic plant. He was looking out at this huge garden. And I thought at first, well, maybe he didn't hear me. So I repeated my question, and then he turned around and he said to me, I really don't know, but I think it's because the Lord saw that I still had work to do for him. And the Lord did. Well, in spite of what the pastor said, I know lunch is coming, so I want to tell you one more very critical incident, because I was getting old enough to sense, to understand a little. We had managed to flee. I need to put the, okay. Why is it not advancing? Excuse me. You know it wouldn't be a meeting without technology undercutting us. There we go. Thank you. The wartime. The Germans came. They confiscated the books from the Book and Bible House, the church money. They called in my dad too, but they said, "Oh, we're going to leave you alone, because once Hitler wins all of Europe, he's going to be God, and then we'll shut you down." Then the communists came back. And now my father knew. And when I went back in 1992, I was able to prove it to him, because it haunted him all his life should I have left. And I proved to him he would have been killed instantly. So when war came, next slide, please. Many, many deportations. This is one of the railroad stations near where one of my relatives lives, and you can see the cross. That commemorates how 40,000 people out of my little country were shipped to Siberia or killed in one night. So you know that the Lord guided my father. Next slide. The bombings came. The Russians wanted that area back. The Nazis wanted to keep it. And we were a very convenient little target. Now this is very interesting, because if you look at that church tower there, when I went back to work in my country in 1996, that church had been authentically restored, and I practiced the organ in that tower. So it was a very meaningful picture for me. Next slide. You can see the devastation of a beautiful old city. And this next slide shows you the before and after. You can see what devastation occurred. Well, my parents finally realized we had to leave. I was just a little kid, but I still remember being on this flatbed car, tiny as I was, and my mother says, God must have used me, because in that desperation, and we had one suitcase for the four of us, and of course I was just little, so I didn't need much, but my mother remembers that I, as a little kid, looked up and I said, "Look, Mommy, the stars are going with us." We wandered through a lot of, there we go. This was our path, our escape path, trying to keep ahead of communism as it kept advancing, trying to stay away from the bombings. Many times I know it was miraculous. One time, my brother is 4 years older, my mother tells me that we were on a railway station, and those were particularly vulnerable because the bombings would destroy that means of travel. And my brother looking up at my mother with tears in his eyes saying, "Now I want to die." The poor kid had had it. Well, one very dramatic incident that means a great deal to me happened after the war. If you remember your history, Germany had been divided into 4 parts, and 4 major powers controlled each part. That's how the Berlin Wall came. That's how migration was restricted. And we were really fortunate, if you can see the end of the trail there, to end up in the British zone. The British and American military were very kind. Anybody here served in the military or have relatives? You know, your kind were my first heroes. But I hate to tell you, my first crush was on a Canadian soldier. He was good looking. I have a picture to prove it, had the beret and all that. And, well, I was 5 years old, but he was good looking. So we thought that life was going to be good. We were living with an Adventist farmer and his family. I still have memories when I work in that northern part of Europe, especially there's a university I've been working with. When I'm up there, even the air brings back memories. I think you know what I mean. There are these senses that are aroused. So we thought everything was going to be fine. Eventually, it was our hope, because Germany was in shambles, it was our hope to get to the promised land. Any of you who've had kids or have kids, have you seen the little movie called An American Tale? It's about this little mouse that comes to America. I see you nodding. Okay, there's a very typical example of people like me, where there's this mouse family living under the roots of a tree, and these invading, rampaging armies destroy their fields, their houses, and they're huddled under the tree. And Grandpa Mouse says, "We must go to America. In America, there are no cats." That was the way that many of us felt. America, that was going to be our refuge, our place where we could really live. Well, what happened was that the big four powers had a meeting one night, and they decided to shift those borders without telling anybody, because they knew there would be a mass exodus out of the new Soviet zone. My father woke up one Sunday morning, was walking down to the little village from the farm, and he thought, this is unusually quiet. Well, all radios had been confiscated. So if you wanted the people to know anything, you put up posters on the walls, on the fences, on the trees, and he noticed those new posters. So he walked up to one of them, and to his horror, it said, "This part of Germany now belongs to the Soviet Union. Anyone caught leaving their home will be shot on sight." He hurried back home. Farmer and his family and our little family, we all got together, and I can still, tiny as I was, remember the air of desperation. After all the wanderings, the escapes, the miracles, were caught. Remember, anyone leaving their home will be shot on sight. Finally, the farmer said, okay, we must do something. And my parents, naturally, as you would say, no, it's too dangerous. He said, no, we must do something. I know this little road that goes through the woods, and I think I can take you there and sneak you across the border. So all horses and oxen had been confiscated for the war. I still remember he got this poor little cow, hitched her. In Estonia, we have no gender. Everybody's an it, so I still reflect some of that when I get mixed up. So hitched her to the wagon. The four of us climbed in, and he and his son were sitting up front, and we started, and it was so eerily quiet. That was a good sign, because we knew that the communists hadn't yet taken over that area. We started down the road, and pretty soon the farmer says, "Get down quick. There's 2 soldiers up ahead." We didn't know who they were, but to our enormous relief, there were 2 British soldiers. So they came up, and my dad knew just a little bit of English, so he got out of the cart, and he started to explain to them why, for us, it was so dangerous, because the Soviets considered us deserters and criminals because we had fled their jurisdiction. We would have been shot immediately. So my dad explained this situation, and he also said, "Pastor, I have 7 churches, and most of them are on the other side of the border. I need to take care of them." Well, the soldiers whispered one to the other, and then they said, "Okay, we'll let you go if you promise not to tell anyone you've seen us." Now think about it. That had to be the world's easiest promise to keep, because we didn't want to see anybody else, much less talk about it. We got to the border, and hundreds of other people had thought of the same thing. Nobody was going anywhere. The farmer said goodbye, left with his son, and before I forget to tell you, many years later, my parents heard from him, and he got home safely. It was an enormous relief for them. So we sat down. We didn't have many things, so it was just a moment to get out of the cart. My dad went up to a British soldier, once again explained in his limited English why we were in such danger. And of course, the soldier said, I can't do anything, but I tell you what, if you leave your family back here, I'll let you run the 2 miles or so, and if you get the right permission from the right person, okay, Pastor, you know Army bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is bureaucracy anywhere. So my dad was really taking a chance, and the soldier said, you bring me a note and I'll let you across. Well, I think it was the only time in my life I was an insurance policy. If we stayed back there, they'd let my dad go. Now, unfortunately, I even have friends here in America who were separated by war that way, not just Estonians. So my dad ran, and I truly believe God was with him, not just to give him the energy, but he found the right official. That official listened to him. He didn't say much. This was a British official because they had moved their headquarters already, but the communists hadn't taken over the border yet. And so he took a little piece of paper and wrote a note. My dad stuck it in his pocket and ran back. My friends, my sisters, you can imagine. Here's my mother, 2 little kids. At least she spoke the language, because many Europeans speak many languages. No family, but church members were our family. So my dad comes back, shows a note to the same soldier, and they motion for us to come. Now, I spend a good deal of my life standing in lines, at airports especially. I don't like it when someone cuts line. I let them know. Well, you can imagine the murmur in the crowd. How can they go? Why can't we go? We weren't asking. We crossed the border, hurried down the road with the very few belongings we had, and then we heard about 15 minutes later, we heard the rumble of Army trucks. My dad went and hid because every Army would pick up any person that looked able-bodied, any male. So as we were watching from where we were hiding, it was the communist soldiers. 15 minutes, my friends, and I wouldn't be here with you, much less alive. 15 minutes, but God answered prayer. My dad kept the note, and here it is. This is my ticket to freedom. My evidence that God intervenes in our lives, but also my evidence that God uses people, even sometimes when they don't know it. The power of one person to make a difference. The note, which you can't read very well, basically says that if you can do so without arousing too much curiosity from the others, you can let this man and his family through. Not rational, but it made all the difference in the world. And I like to think that God did use us. Like my dad said, he worked with Hispanic people. He was a missionary in Bolivia. My brother was for 22 years a missionary in Africa. I have worked for the church, for people. The power of one person to make a difference. This is my legacy. Well, fortunately, something happened that I never dreamed would happen, and that's the Soviet Union broke up. I was able to go back. I waited for a year, but I was able to go back. I found all my relatives. Could not imagine that. I found my dad's church. And he lived one more year after I went back, and I was able to close the cycle for him and say they understood. They didn't feel like you deserted or ran away, which meant so much to him. And I also, like I said, proved that he would have been killed immediately. Beautiful little country. This is over my favorite overlook at the city, the old city of Tallinn, looking out at the water. You can see that bank of clouds. A lot of our days look very much like it did this morning. I don't know what it's like outside. And we don't count inches of rain. We count days of sunshine. And it's pretty cold. But there's the rainbow of promise. The rainbow of promise that God will not just be with us, but will help us help others. One of my favorite quotations is by an obscure Quaker who lived in New England when the Quakers were settling that area. Now, a lot of people attribute this to William Penn, who was your famous Quaker. But Stephen Grillet really said this as it is. And what interests me is as I've used this quote with all kinds of groups that I've worked with around the world, they can relate to it. In fact, I had done some speaking in Taiwan, and they sent me a gift of a piece of wood, beautiful wood, with this engraved on it. I expect to pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness that I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. Let's remember, as we think about our lives, the power of one person to make a difference. As we meet this afternoon to talk about how you can make a difference. Fundraising sometimes really turns people off. In fact, I have often joked about the fact that the best way to turn off unwanted conversation when I'm traveling is to say to somebody, I'm a fundraiser. But what is it about, folks? The Bible is full of good examples of how generosity has made a difference in others. And I also have a lot of evidence, research evidence, that the Bible, when it said it's more blessed to give than to receive, it's true. And I'm a witness to that throughout my life. So let's not forget the ending of our story that we began with. The ending of that scripture that was read so beautifully. Go and do likewise. May the Lord bless you as you do that.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner. We'll be concluding our service. We don't have a closing song. We're going to be ending with our closing prayer. Invite everyone to come over to the fellowship hall, to our community service building for our fellowship meal, followed at 2 o'clock by our training. Thank you guys so much as we go out and we